And she knew what he was asking, and he thought, well, so just walking, she said. The immigration officer said, why don't you just walk here? Anyway, Willie Shawcross, your turn.
Well, I'm sure you will all agree that it's a typical David Tang dirty trick to make me speak after those two brilliant and inspiring speeches by these two fascinating and superb women writers. It's a method of putting down the man on the desk. But David and I have known each other for a very long time, and I was expecting that, so I'll have to live with it. David's original offer to everybody in this hall, which is a very generous offer, a wonderful copy of Ulysses, for the
1934.
1934.
I have the 1922.
Oh, this is really wonderful.
I've got two at my home.
One upmanship, two upmanship, one down, two others. What have I bid? Anyway, I just wanted to point, David said there will be lots of stupid questions, but the best question is going to get that marvellous prize. I would like to say something slightly different. I was travelling with Kofi Annan a few years ago. I wrote a book about him and the UN's attempts to come to some sort of terms with the horrors of the world. And Kofi used to say very, very nicely whenever he was in an audience, particularly a student audience, there's no such thing as a stupid question, there's only stupid answers. Which I think is a very encouraging thing. So remember, David, every question here is going to be intelligent, so it's going to be very, very hard for you to give this prize. And it serves him right, given such a difficult task. Anyway, my journey as a writer is not nearly as interesting and as brilliant as either Erica's or Jung, so I won't bore you with it for too long. But I was at Oxford in the 60s, and I was going to join the Foreign Office, and then I went on holiday in 1968 in Czechoslovakia with my sister, Joanna, and the Russians invaded. I went there because it was interesting, because it was a revolt for freedom against Soviet occupation. And the Czechs were, in the summer of 1968, amazingly excited at the idea that they could finally liberalize communism and produce what Alexander Dubček, the Czechoslovak leader at that time, called communism with a human face. And the Russians invaded to crush communism with a human face, and it was immensely emotional, and all the Czechs whom I met in the summer of 1968 with joy in their hearts and songs in their lips lost all that. And I was very much caught up with the emotion of it, and I decided not to join the Foreign Office, but to write a book about Alexander Dubček, the Czechoslovak leader. And I managed to persuade a publisher in London, Weidenfeld and Nicholson, to give me an advance of £50. £50 on signature and £50 if I delivered a publishable book. And £50 in those days was a lot more than it is today. I mean, you could take a ferry with a car to across the channel for £10 or £11, I think, and the petrol from Calais to Prague was probably another £15. So it was an opportunity, and I wrote this biography of Dubček, who was by then under house arrest, or under real arrest actually, in Slovakia, and very few people were brave enough to talk to me, but nonetheless I did what I could and researched it in libraries and in newspaper morgues and so on, with the help of a Slovak interpreter, and managed to produce this book, and it was published the next year, and that's how I started. And then subsequently to that, quite soon after that, in 1970, I came to Asia for the first time and to Hong Kong for the first time. I went to Vietnam, which was, as you know, at the height of the war then, and after wandering around, but after trying to understand what was going on in Vietnam, with the American army was still there in full force, and I then came to Hong Kong for the first time in 1970. And as anybody does who comes to Hong Kong, who has half a brain, fell in love with the place because it's such a superb, vibrant, and intellectually and emotionally challenging and exciting place to be. And every time I come here, I feel that again. And every time I come here, I think, my God, why is it so long since I came last time? Why have I not been here every year, twice a year? So I'm extremely grateful to David for inviting me to come here to talk to you today. So absolute thrill to be here once again. And of course, Hong Kong has changed enormously since 1970, but the changes always seem in character with the freedom and the exhilaration of the place. And one of the crucial visits from my point of view that I came on was in just after the massacre in Tiananmen, when those of you who are old enough will remember there was it was horror in Hong Kong and what this meant for Hong Kong only 6 or 7 years before the handover. And there were massive demonstrations in Central, and there's placards put on the statue in Central, in the square, and it was a very, very powerful moment. And the British government, I thought, behaved very badly in not offering British residents, 3 million British residents in Hong Kong, immediate visas to come to, British passport holders to come to live in England. And I think we would have done a huge benefit to ourselves, to Britain, to the British economy, as well as to helping Hong Kong and assuage the fear of Hong Kong Chinese that they did have an escape route if they wanted. And I wrote a little pamphlet about it at the time called Kowtow, and it was the British government kowtowing to the Chinese government, which there was a criticism of both the Chinese governments and the British government, and it's called, the subtitle is called After Tiananmen Square, a plea on behalf of Hong Kong. But I'm glad to say that the worst fears that people felt here then in 1990, 91, 92 were not, I think, realised, and Hong Kong can... Well, that's a very interesting point. I'd love you to expound on that when we come to David managing the questions. That's probably the most intelligent remark you've made.
Is that question? Who is the man who shouted out? Yes, right. You're a marked man.
I'm very interested in the stupid answer to come.
Sit down.
This is going rather well, I think. David, this is what you wanted. You want to riot.
I have to say that the problem with a lot of forums and so forth, they're far too serious. But of course, being witty and laughing and so forth does not mean that it cannot be serious. So I hope that all of you will have very witty questions and intelligent questions and so forth to follow. But let Mr. Shawcross finish off whatever he was.
Well, I'll come to an end, because after Vietnam I wrote several other books about the Shah of Iran and his fall, and about the United Nations, as I said, and Rupert Murdoch, and the sort of extraordinary revolution in communications we've seen in the last 30 years. And then more recently, I was very lucky because the Queen in Britain asked me to write the official biography of her mother, the Queen Mother, who, as you know, died at the age of 101 in 2002. And the joy of being an official biographer to a monarch in England after their death is that you have unique access to all their private papers, all the royal family's private papers in the Royal Archives in Windsor Castle. And it's quite astonishing. And box after box of letters and private papers were brought to me. And the first thing I realized was that this woman, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, as she was born, was from the age of 10 a fantastic letter writer with beautiful, beautiful handwriting and a buoyant, optimistic view of the world from childhood onwards. And she wrote adorably and brilliantly and very movingly, particularly during the war. But I'll just read you a couple of paragraphs of things she wrote. This was a letter to Princess Margaret, her daughter, which she wrote in 1958. She said, "Darling, last week I gave a cocktail party for 200 bishops from overseas. By the time that everybody knows that the Queen Mother liked to drink or two, that she was never drunk, but she loved Dubonnet and gin or champagne. She said once, when you're feeling down, the only thing to do is to have a sip of champagne and try not to weep." A great phrase. I thought of having t-shirts made in that slogan. I'll get to it. By the time that 8 o'clock came, they were in cracking form. They tucked into all the canapes and tossed down martini after martini, especially the American bishops, who I'm sure had been entertained on warm sherry for weeks before. And then in another letter in similar terms, she wrote to Princess Margaret some years later, when she was traveling in the Bahamas, in British territories in the West Indies. Darling, I always had very bad luck with the drinks. Perhaps because I'm considered a frail invalid at the age of 74, I'm always given delicious fruit drinks with so little alcohol that one feels quite sick. Then I ask timidly if I might have just a very little gin in it, and then too much is poured in. So I have to ask for more ice to stop my throat being burnt to shreds, and so it goes on. This is usually at Government House, of course. And just finally, on a more serious note, as I said, during the war, she and the King were extraordinarily symbols of the heart of Britain, and they stayed in London during the Blitz, and they were enormously important to keeping up morale throughout the 6 years of the war. And in November 1940, the Buckingham Palace was bombed, and they were both very nearly killed in the morning. And then they had lunch and went into the East End of London, which had been much, much more badly bombed that and every other day. And she wrote to her mother-in-law, Queen Mary, "I really felt as if I was walking in a dead city in East London. We walked down a little empty street, all the houses were evacuated, and through the broken windows one saw all the poor possessions, photographs, beds, just as they were left. At the end of the street is a school which was hit and collapsed on the top of 500 people waiting to be evacuated. About 200 bodies are still under the ruins. It does affect me so, seeing this terrible and senseless destruction. I really mind it much more than being bombed myself. The people are marvelous and full of fight. One cannot imagine that life could become so terrible. We must win in the end. We must win a real peace, not a Nazi peace." So, as you see, I think she's a good writer, and that's been a great joy for me writing that over the last few years. And now I have to think of something else to do. But thank you for very much.
It's me with whatever I need. And he talked about taking a walk after a morning of writing, and he would find something, a shoelace, a bottle cap, this was when he was working in Paris, that would unlock the next part of the book. And I think that really tells a great story about the writer's process. Everybody is interested in the writer's process, but nobody wants to really hear the answer. And the answer is that we don't really know where the initial inspiration comes from. There can be a line that then becomes a poem, that then becomes a novel. We don't really, it's quite mysterious where this comes from. It may come from a dream that you had the night before. If you want to write, you should always keep a little notebook of lines, of dreams, of snatches of conversation overheard somewhere, because you never know where the next poem, book, essay will come from. And you have to be always alert to it. But what Joyce says is very, very interesting to me. When you're written out, when you've done everything you can imaginatively for that day, and then you go to exercise your legs, and in your head you're trying to solve the problem the book has created for you. And I always think of Joyce saying, "Chance gives me what I need." He was a minute observer of the details of life. He was a great observer and hearer, listener of conversation. There are whole parts of Ulysses that sound like his wife Nora speaking. Molly Bloom, Nora, he morphs Nora into Molly Bloom. And of course Molly Bloom is also himself in Ulysses. So to be a writer means to be ever looking, listening, and filling your mind and your notebook with the strangeness and marvelousness of reality around you. Nobody ever asks that question of a writer. They never say, when they say, how do you write? They say, well, is it the morning? Is it the night? Are you wearing a t-shirt? Are you wearing pajamas? All of which doesn't matter. What matters is how do you catch what's going on in your dream life, in the unconscious, in whatever you want to call it. How do you catch it, and how do you write it down so you don't lose it? And where do those things come from? We don't know. It's quite mysterious for a poet and a novelist and a short story writer, etc., an imaginative writer. It's true also of my colleagues who have written memoir and nonfiction that certain subjects are fascinating to you and others not at all. How do you see, is when I teach writing, I tell my students that we all begin by imitating the writers we love, all of us. I was writing Nabokovian pastiches throughout my 20s because I thought Nabokov was the greatest writer. I don't think so anymore. But what I have to say is that we all start out imitating and wanting to. I wanted to be Oscar Wilde or George Bernard Shaw when I was a teenager, or perhaps William Butler Yeats. We imitate, but there comes this moment when what we have to say and want to say fuses at a white heat with the voice we were meant to write in. If you can write in the voice in which you speak, you're way ahead of the game. And most young writers can't. But you keep on till you find that distinctive voice that sounds like nobody else. And it doesn't matter if you're in your pajamas, at a desk, standing up, lying on the grass, whether it's morning, whether it's night, none of that matters. But the most important thing for any writer is to access that dream life that feeds the work.